Because the Cold War doubles as a conflict between two countries, the USA and the USSR, and between two ideologies, capitalism and communism, the cause of the Cold War is debatable, and several causes can be suggested. Because capitalism and communism are usually seen as antithetical, it can be argued that the Cold War began when communism began, in 1917, with the Russian Revolution. Or, if not quite in 1917, then in the early 1920s, when Lenin and his Bolsheviks consolidated their power in Russia and tried to spread communism to the West, although they were quickly unsuccessful, being defeated by the Poles in the Polish-Soviet War in 1919 to 1921. Another commonly argued cause of the Cold War is the beginning of World War II in Europe, 1939. The Soviet Union, now under Stalin, had signed a secret pact with Germany's Hitler, and both countries attacked Poland in September of that year. However, the most popular cause of the Cold War was not the beginning, but the end of World War II in 1945. Stalin, after being betrayed by Hitler in 1941, finished the war on the Allied side, but the tensions between the victorious Western powers and the USSR were already in evidence. The USSR was taking over the countries east of Germany and part of Germany itself, which made the Americans and British somewhat hesitant. The British feared too strong a Soviet presence in Europe, and the Americans wanted a free and open Germany, which would become a large market for its products. The Soviets stood in the way of both. In fact, American General George Patton once famously remarked that when the Americans had gotten to Berlin, they should have kept going on to Moscow. Finally, probably the latest starting date and cause for the Cold War that has been argued is in 1947, the year in which the Soviets acquired the knowledge to make nuclear weapons. Because the Cold War was so heavily wrapped up into nuclear technology, and in technology in general, some will argue that it was caused by the Soviet challenge to American nuclear power, which had been demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. As soon as the term Cold War was popularized to refer to post-war tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, interpreting the cause and the origins of the conflict became a source of heated controversy among historians, political scientists, and journalists. In particular, historians have sharply disagreed as to who was responsible for the breakdown of Soviet-US relations after the Second World War, and whether the conflict between the two superpowers could have been avoided. Historians have also disagreed on what exactly the Cold War was, what the sources of the conflict was, and how to disentangle patterns of action and reaction between the two sides. While the explanations of the origins of the conflict in academic discussions are complex and diverse, several general schools of thought on the subject can be identified. Historians commonly speak of three differing approaches to the study of the Cold War: the orthodox view, revisionist view, and post-revisionist view. However, much of the historiography of the Cold War weaves together two or even all three of these broad categories, and more recent scholars have tended to address issues that transcend the concerns of all three schools of thought. The first school of interpretation to emerge was the orthodox view. This orthodox school of thought places the responsibility for the Cold War on the Soviet Union and its expansion into Eastern Europe, and on Soviet ideology, which based on Marxism-Leninism was ultimately aimed at establishing capitalist states in order to spread world revolution. Thomas A. Bailey, for example, argued in his 1950 America Faces Russia that the breakdown of post-war peace was the result of Soviet expansionism in the immediate post-war years. Bailey argued that Stalin violated promises he had made at Yalta, imposed Soviet-dominated regimes on unwilling Eastern European populations, and conspired to spread communism throughout the world. From this view, U.S. officials were forced to respond to Soviet aggression with the Truman Doctrine, plans to contain communist subversion around the world, and the Marshall Plan. U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s disillusionized some historians and created a cadre of historians with sympathy towards the communist position and antipathy towards American policies. This group sought to challenge the premises of containment and thus with the assumptions of the orthodox approach to understanding the Cold War. Revisionist accounts emerged in the wake of the Vietnam War in the context of a larger rethinking of the U.S. role in international affairs, which was seen more in terms of American empire or hegemony. While the new school of thought spanned many differences among individual scholars, the works comprising it were generally responses in one way or another to William Appleman Williams' 1959 volume, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. Williams challenged the long-held assumptions of orthodox accounts, arguing that Americans had always been empire-building people, even while American leaders denied it. Following Williams, revisionist or left-wing writers placed more responsibility for the breakdown of post-war peace on the United States, citing a range of U.S. efforts to isolate and confront the Soviet Union well before the end of World War II. According to Williams and later revisionist or left-wing writers, U.S. policymakers shared an overarching concern with maintaining the market system and democracy. In order to achieve that objective, they pursued an open-door policy abroad, aimed at increasing access to foreign markets for U.S. business and agriculture. Revisionist scholars challenged the widely accepted scholarly research that the Soviet leaders were committed to post-war expansionism. They cited evidence that the Soviet Union's occupation of Eastern Europe had a defensive rationale, and that the Soviet leaders saw themselves as attempting to avoid encirclement by the United States and its allies. In this view, the Soviet Union was too weak and devastated after the end of the Second World War as to be unable to pose any serious threat to the United States. Moreover, the US maintained a nuclear monopoly until the USSR tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949. Revisionist historians have also contradicted the scholarly work that proves that the origins of the Cold War date no further back than the immediate post-war period. Notably, Waldo Lefebvre, in his landmark study, America, Russia, and the Cold War, argued that the Cold War had its origins in the 19th century conflicts between Russia and America over the opening of East Asia to U.S. trade, markets, and influence. Lefebvre argued that the U.S. commitment at the close of World War II ensured a world in which every state was open to U.S. influence and trade, underpinning many of the conflicts that triggered the beginning of the Cold War. Starting with Gar Alperovitz in his Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam, revisionist scholars have focused on the U.S. decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the last days of World War II. In their belief, the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, in effect, started the Cold War. According to Alperovitz, the bombs were not used on an already defeated Japan to win the war, but to intimidate the Soviets, signaling that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons to stop Soviet expansion. However, this they failed to do. Historians Joyce and Gabriel Kolko's The Limits of Power, The World in U.S. Foreign Policy 1954 has also received considerable attention in the historiography of the Cold War. The Kolkos argued that U.S. policy was both reflexively anti-communist and counter-revolutionary. The U.S. was not necessarily fighting Soviet influence, but any form of challenge to the U.S. economic and political prerogatives through either covert or military means. In this sense, the Cold War is less a story of rivalry between two blocs, and more a story of the ways by which the dominant states within each bloc controlled and disciplined their own populations and clients, and about who supported and stood to benefit from increased arms production and political anxiety over a perceived external enemy. The revisionist interpretation produced a critical reaction of its own. In a variety of ways, post-revisionist scholarships, before the fall of communism, challenged earlier works on the origins and cause of the Cold War. During the period, post-revisionists challenged the revisionists by accepting some of their findings but rejecting most of their key claims, another current attempt to strike a balance between the orthodox and revisionist camps, identifying areas of responsibility for the origins of the conflict on both sides. Thomas G. Patterson in Soviet-American Confrontation, for example, viewed Soviet hostility and U.S. efforts to dominate the post-war world as equally responsible for the Cold War. The influential work of this approach was John Lewis Gaddis's The United States and the Origins of the Cold War, 1941 to 1947. The account was immediately hailed as the beginning of a new school of thought on the Cold War, claiming to synthesize a variety of interpretations. Gaddis then maintained that neither side can bear sole responsibility for the onset of the Cold War. He did, however, emphasize the constraints imposed on U.S. policymakers due to the complications of domestic politics. Gaddis, in addition, has criticized some revisionist scholars, particularly Williams, for failing to understand the role of Soviet policy in the origins of the Cold War. And Gaddis's 1983 distillation of post-revisionist scholarships became a major channel for guiding subsequent Cold War research. An almost immediate move to subvert the barely erected post-revisionist framework came from Melvin P. Loeffler, who demonstrated that it was not so much the actions of the Kremlin as it was fears about socio-economic dislocation, revolutionary nationalism, British weakness, and Eurasian vacuums of power that triggered U.S. initiatives to mold an international system to comport with its concept of security. This provoked strong rebuttals from the post-revisionists, though Loeffler deemed their objections inaccurate and unsubstantiated. Out of the post-revisionist literature emerged a new area of inquiry that was more sensitive to nuance and interested less in the question of who started the conflict than in offering insight into U.S. and Soviet actions and perspectives. From this perspective, the Cold War was not so much the responsibility of either side, but rather the result of predictable tensions between two world powers that had been suspicious of one another for nearly a century. For example, Ernest May wrote in a 1984 essay, "After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union were doomed to be antagonists. There probably was never any real responsibility that the post-1945 relationship could be anything but hostility verging on conflict. Traditions, belief systems, propinquity, and convenience all combined to stimulate antagonism, and almost no factor operated in either country to hold it back." From this view of post-revisionism emerged a line of inquiry that examines how Cold War actors perceived various events and the degree of misperception involved in the failure of the two sides to reach common understandings of their wartime alliance and their disputes. But after the opening of the Soviet archives, while Gaddis does not hold either side entirely responsible for the onset of the conflict, he has now argued that the Soviets should be held clearly more accountable for the ensuing problems. According to Gaddis, Stalin was in a much better position to compromise than his Western counterparts, given his much broader power within his own regime than Truman, who was often undermined by vociferous political oppositions at home. Asking if it were possible to predict that the wartime alliance would fall apart within a matter of months, leaving in its place nearly a half-century of the Cold War, and Gaddis wrote in his 1997 book, We Now Know, Rethinking the Cold War, "Geography, demography, and tradition contributed to this outcome, but did not determine it. It took men responding unpredictably to circumstances to forge the chain of causation, and it took Stalin in particular responding predictably to his own authoritarian, paranoid, and narcissistic predisposition to lock it into place." For Stalin, Gaddis continues, world politics was an extension of Soviet politics, which was in turn an extension of Stalin's preferred personal environment, a zero-sum game, in which achieving security for one meant depriving everyone else of it.